Good morning again. I'm Laura Silvia Battaglia, and I have the pleasure to present this panel, Rethinking Africa, how to make the African continent an essential partner for Europe. And during the last meeting of Vision in Taormina, the roundtable about Africa was Back to Africa, the neighborhood as Europe's next frontier. And some main topics emerged, but the main was as follows. We are still looking at this global south with a post-colonial approach, and we have to stop that. We have to change that in every means this happens: business, development programs, education, women empowerment, and so on. Otherwise, we will lose the opportunities we gained in the past, compared with the Chinese and Russian or Turkish approach to Africa. And this will be my main question to all speakers, among all other questions. So, decolonizing the approach, we have to think Africa is the way for thinking Africa. So above this umbrella question, I would like to present all the speakers of today. They are Luca Verzichelli, Kelly Falconer, Kelly Hadzhieva, Robert Tyler, Loredana Teodorescu. And before we have the introduction of Koert Debeuf and the keynote speech of Leslie Masdop, which is with us, but online. So first, Koert, if you can introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll be short. I think in Europe and also the United States, we woke up on the 7th of April 2022 when there was a vote in the UN Human Rights Council about the suspension of Russia in the Council. And a majority voted in favor, but however, from 58 countries abstained, 24 voted against, and 18 countries were, yes or no, strategically absent. Which means if you count that up, actually 100 countries didn't vote in favor of the 193, didn't vote in favor of the suspension of Russia. Of these countries, 40 African countries actually didn't vote in favor. So of the 54, which is a wake-up call, which means that suddenly, let's say, the West, or Europe at least, lost a majority in the UN Security Council, in the UN Human Rights Council. So, and if I talk to African ambassadors or leaders and so forth, you can feel the resentment. They were saying two things, basically. The first was, like, we do not want a new Cold War. We do not want to choose again between Europe and Russia. But secondly, also something very clear is a kind of a resentment, is like, we always have to follow you. We don't want to do that anymore. This resentment is a feeling that, in my impression, is deep down in the entire African continent. And it's not just there, it has been poked up pretty recently, or recently in the last few years, by Russia. Russia is present with the Wagner militias in Libya, in Sudan, in the Central African Republic, in Mali, and they are fueling the idea, like, you know, it's actually France, it's Europe who is right now also making sure that through the sanctions, food is not arriving anymore at your continent, and we are the ones who want to do something about this. You can see a shift in the balance, in my opinion, in Africa. It's a start of a shift that can become much bigger and actually much more problematic. Why is that problematic? I think for two reasons. First of all, I mean, Africa is still a continent of massive resources, but also massive opportunities. But secondly, it's also a country of massive demographics. Right now, the population of Africa is 1.3 billion, and by 2050, that will be doubled to 2.5 billion, or 25% of the world population. If countries like Libya, like Sudan, like Chad, like Mali, like Niger are going to collapse, I mean, the obvious consequence of this is going to be not just a migration, but a weaponized migration by some countries, like, for example, Russia, who want to destabilize Russia. So the question is, what should we do there? And indeed, as you say, perhaps decolonizing our approach. The EU has started a new initiative called the Global Gateway in which they kind of freed 150 billion euro. But as the people who wrote the plan, it's a kind of guaranteeing money. So it's a kind of monopoly money, as they told me. So the question is that going to be enough for our new approach for Africa? I'm afraid it's not, but I would say it's up to the panel to find some new ideas and new solutions for a new approach to Africa that would go from, like the EU has already renamed its development cooperation DG into international partnership DG. I think that's the first good step, but perhaps much more is needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Koert Debeuf, Director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy Europe and Editor-in-Chief at the EU Observer. Thank you for your introduction. And yes, we saw what happened during the last months in sub-Saharan Africa, especially between Mali and the countries around regarding the Wagner militias. Also different approaches of the states on it. Some states, again, France to be protected, and others rely more on Russia. But I think we will have the time to discuss this, but I don't want to that Leslie Marstop will wait so long because he's already online, I think half an hour before. Leslie Marstop is the Vice President of the New Development Bank. And my question is for you, and then of course feel free to add anything you want, that Africa is playing a crucial role in the energy sector, in particular in the energy transition, sustainable energy, renewable energy. This key sector is developing in Africa a lot, and is becoming a priority in the African countries' agenda as well as in Europe. But the fact is also that the point that the goal is now having Africa independent on energy business using solar energy. The room is there and the historical momentum is there, and what you can do and want to do about, especially now that we have more problems regarding energy.
Thank you very much for having me, and I would have loved to be there in person since I am in Europe at the moment. But thanks also for inviting me to share some thoughts with you today. I'd like off by starting by saying that it is very important, especially in moments of crises, to understand and to analyze the more deep-seated structural long-term trends. I think it is very important to do that because we could easily look at a very myopic approach into the short term because of the nature of the crisis that the world is confronted with now, whether it be rising energy prices, of inflation in general, energy insecurity in the world, a conflict here in Europe around Ukraine and so on. So the first point I'd like to make is that especially in a moment like today, where we've got experts on the panel, that we should look at the more deep-seated, longer-term trends. And in that regard, I believe that Africa and Europe, our futures are intertwined and deeply interconnected through historical ties, but also in terms of the future climate agenda, which is one of the key areas that I'd like to focus on. The first point that I'd like to make is demographics, and we've already heard reference made to that. Africa today, as we have already heard, the average age in Africa is just over 16 years. In Europe, as you know, the average age is around 43 years. The labor market, in looking at the trends, Africa will be 2.5 billion people by 2050. That's the combination of China and more than China and India combined, if you like. More than 1/4 of all the labor force in the world will come from Africa. You know, the doctors, the lawyers, the nurses, the policemen in Europe in the next decade and decades to come will come from my continent. So the demographic dividend is one of the central areas to understand if we look at the Africa-Europe interconnectivity. The second point I'd like to make is that because of the historical history of Africa, unfortunately, the largest numbers of fragile and conflict states are in Africa. In other words, countries that experience high levels of institutional and social fragility, and countries affected by violent conflict. Let me give you a very, very worrying and scary statistic. At the moment, almost half of the people who live in extreme poverty in the world live in Africa. But by 2030, And let me remind you, 2030 is only 8 years away. The World Bank did a report last year in 2021, released in January, where they suggested that more than 80%, 80% of the people living in extreme poverty, the definition, by the way, of extreme poverty are people living on below $2 a day. More than 80% of those people will live in Africa. And you're talking here about large countries like Niger, Nigeria, Madagascar, Chad, Sudan, and so on. Unless we deal with that issue and work on economic development over the next decade or two to come, we will be creating a major crisis. There are, however, significant economic opportunities associated with the economic trajectory in Africa that I also want to make reference to. The second point I want to make before I lead into my final point around climate change is that it is important for Europe to recognize that the historical starting point in dealing with this transition to net zero and the green economy of Africa is very different to Europe. Europe was able to industrialize during a time when coal was and carbon emissions were not an issue, when the price of fossil fuels and the contribution of carbon intensive emissions making to the world was not really at the center point. Today, there are large numbers of Africans, give you an example, more than 450 million people in Africa do not have access to electricity. Many of these countries have coal, have a dirty resource under the ground, but nevertheless a resource under the ground that they can mine and establish, let's say, new coal-fired power stations. We have to encourage these countries to look at renewable sources of energy. So energy is one of the core areas of a deep economic partnership that we have to develop between Europe and Africa. The elements of that partnership is already beginning to emerge. There's a very strong partnership today, for example, between Germany and South Africa to help South Africa move away from its 88% coal-infused power grid. During COP26 last year in November, a package of $8.5 billion was announced between the United States, Germany, the European Union more broadly, and South Africa to help take South Africa on a path towards a better energy mix using more renewable energy sources. The final point I'd like to make is that the strategies towards net zero and the long-term partnership around climate change represents, I believe, the biggest opportunity of economic partnership between Africa and Europe. And building an industrial strategy, for example, around green hydrogen represents massive opportunities. There's a number of companies in Germany and others that have partnerships in place in Namibia, for example, in South Africa, because we have huge amounts of high-quality sun and solar power, so we are able through electrolysis to produce quality green hydrogen and supply that to Europe. In short, what I'm wanting to argue and leave you with today is the following. Europe has some of the most advanced climate policies. Europe, in fact, wants to be the first continent to be carbon neutral as a continent. But Africa, let me just remind you, Africa, as large as the continent is, 1.3 billion people. Europe is only 740 million. We are practically double the size in population to Europe. But we only produce 3.8% carbon emissions in the world. Europe is, I think, something like 13%. China, for example, the largest carbon emitter, is around 27%. So you can see that Africa's footprint is significantly lower, one of the smallest shares as a continent. But because of our potential on the energy side to produce green energy, and especially I mentioned green hydrogen, solar energy, wind, and so on, we can be a significant element of the solutions towards the path on net zero. The final point I'd like to make is around the trading system. Europe is going to introduce next year, as you know, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is essentially a new tax, if you like, a tax that will be imposed to reflect the carbon intensity of goods. So we will be disadvantaged by this new trading regime as Africa because this tax will make potentially our goods uncompetitive. it's very important, I think, for Europe and the African continent, in my view, to explore the potential for a Green Deal, a European-Africa Green Deal, so that we can deal with the potential tensions that could emerge when Europe introduced the carbon border adjustment mechanism, because you have essentially outsourced your carbon-intensive production. Labor-intensive goods are produced outside of Europe, either in China or other parts of the world. But when those goods come back into Europe, you plan to impose a tax on it starting next year, and it will be fully implemented by 2026. It is possible that a source of new trade tensions could emerge around this deal. And I think that Europe and China has the potential to craft a partnership that could involve a deal of sorts, a trade deal of sorts between the two continents to help fast track the process towards a reduction in carbon emissions in Africa, and at the same time contributes to Europe's intention to be carbon neutral as a continent. I remain very optimistic about the potential in Africa. We've got a young population that is adopting technology at an unprecedented rate. If you look at some of the most exciting startups in the technology space, they are happening in many African countries, in Nigeria, in Ghana, in South Africa, in Rwanda, and so on. So there's a huge entrepreneurship, innovation driven by technology that needs to be encouraged, needs to be nurtured. And I'm hoping that more venture capital funds, more private equity funds will be looking at the potential in Africa, given that we have this massive consumer base, this rise in the middle class that will continue to accelerate over the next decade or two to come. But at the same time, and this is where I'd like to end off, at the same time, there's a huge developmental agenda. As I mentioned, there's still more than 450 million people who do not have access to energy, continuous supply of electricity. Think about that through the lens of children needing to study at night, or think about it through the lens of clinics where women need to give birth. Without electricity in many of these rural and smaller towns in Africa, economic development will remain challenging, and Africa will face extreme poverty for years and years to come. It is our historic role and duty, Europeans and African leadership together, to reverse what is at the moment, as I said, a very problematic projection by the World Bank, suggesting that almost more than 80% of the extremely poor people in the world will be concentrated in the African continent. That could, as you know, be seeds of instability, of extreme social instability, of terrorism, and so on. So it's in our collective interest to deal with those challenges. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Leslie Mastop, Vice President of the New Development Bank, for being with us. Just a quick summary of the bullet points of this speech. Developments in Africa is not so well known from the large population in Europe, let's say. And this market and its population is growing a lot. The technology startups are growing as well. Leslie Marsdorp mentioned Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, and I can add something about, for example, the use of the drones in agriculture. Most of the main projects are going in Africa. And same as professionals and experts in different sectors are present in Africa, and they are going to other countries. Why, in the same time, in other areas of Africa, people don't have access to energy? So it's worth for Europe to recognize that, yes, it is. We have to craft partnerships, trade partnerships, due also to our long presence in the continent. And this will help to stop the seeds of not stability. So going back to the main question of the panel, Luca Verzichelli, Deputy Head of University of Siena. Decolonizing the approach we have to think Africa is the way for rethinking Africa, talking from an EU perspective, or instead do we have to stop feeling guilty for what we did in the far past and not so far as well?
You, Laura, Silvia, I'll try to be brief. There's a lot of stimulations behind this question. I think that we have real expertise and real experience on field here. So I'll try to save time, bringing some little points and probably a couple of provocations from a point of view of not an expert in Africa, but an expert or a supposed expert of university management. And this question about feeling guilty, it's particularly relevant here because I think we have created a lot of programs in this perspective, and probably now we should say abandon the idea of asking ourselves about our responsibility. But we have another responsibility, how to get out from this, creating real cooperation and European cooperation. I really like the idea of this EU-Africa next generation, because this is something really new. Overcoming this idea that our cooperation and the new perspective of cooperation should be the sum of a number of country-based ideas and programs. I think this is the main responsibility we have. Of course, Koert was mentioning this picture we had, very concerning picture about the votes in the UN Human Rights Council that we put in our let's say concept paper, because it is the picture of the day. But I think, and we have the right people here to discuss more robust and clear evidences about the lack of cooperation and the lack of action in Africa. Presence of EU economy in Africa. Okay, we had a little hint because of the reason of time, but we know that, to say the least, we are not growing with that. Presence of EU cooperation. I heard about the different situations, and we know that there is no strategy of convergence. Yesterday, Italy had an important meeting with Algeria. I didn't hear any word about the convergence with the European Union cooperation in Algeria, in a very crucial point regarding, of course, the energetic policy for the future. But again, I'm not an expert of this. I'll try to bring the discussion, and this is my only substantial point, on the third question, which is the other way around, the concrete impact that African politics and African development can determine on our next generation. And here, the situation is, according to my probably limited perspective, very much concerning. After the Brexit, we lost basically a number of experts as a European Union on African politics. I mean, the Anglo-Saxon tradition was a post-colonial, if you want, but it was a positive approach to African politics. I don't know if Calypso is still with us. In Oxford, I could know numbers of experts on Africa. Doesn't happen in continental Europe. I mean, maybe it's my ignorance. Maybe it's because we have a different system. We have this let's say global approach to international relations on. But we I think still miss expertise on this, and we still have to clarify the way we can spend the money. In our paper, we make this reference to the EU Global Gateway Initiative. I still have to understand to what extent this money and these energies could be somehow channeled in a new direction about getting new generations in Africa and Europe together. I still have my doubts about that. And I can bring you another couple of evidence, and then I'll stop. We have, let's say, two kinds of, or two channels about research and teaching initiatives. Research, I don't know so much about economics and other social science, but in political science and comparative politics in IR, we don't have a very much impact on Africa. Why? Again, because probably we miss expertise. We tend to focus on European governance, even because most of the calls about research are European governance, and it's hard to put together the two things. Even more evident is the lack of expertise on teaching. I'm just back from Tunisia, which is supposed to be one of the most promising target for a number of reasons, and generally speaking, so-called neighbor countries area, that means basically MENA, so not all Africa, to say the least. It's a little bit better, but the rest is really underdeveloped. Nothing in terms of specific programs about capacity building on sub-Saharan Africa. Some relationships with South Africa, but again, more on bilateral basis than a real European Union convergent initiative. So I think that we still have to make more, to put more money on that, and to clarify, especially for our young students, the way we have to work with this money. This is my main point. And to close it, I would say that this evidence we start from the famous vote is an evidence of disconnection, but it's not a political disconnection. I think it's more a cultural disconnection among elites on the two sides of Mediterranean. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Verzichelli, for bringing here at this table the point of view of the Academy. So basically, we can bring more students from sub-Saharan Africa, let's say. And I give the floor now to Heli Hadzhieva. I hope that I'm pronouncing well. She's the founder and director of Dialogue for Europe, a Brussels-based NGO. And my question is, African states have established their own major strategy for the years to come, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement under the African Union. So how EU is profiting from this? Seems it's not profiting from this great market, or maybe it's not understanding so well the advantages, even though knows Africa better than China, than Russia, than the USA and Turkey in the legal framework. So do we need to have a strategy and clear partnership with the continent to not lose our advantages?
Sure, thank you. I will get back to your question, but first let's focus on EU-Africa relations in general. Basically, the EU approach in Africa for long years was just focusing on trade and development aid. And still, Africa is the EU's most important trading partner, because 1/3 of African trade is actually provided by the EU, and the EU is a very important foreign direct investor in the continent. So what happened lately is, first of all, we had a post-Cotonou agreement in 2021, and this changes this development focus. So it's like we started to focus on more comprehensive issues such as human rights, migration, and other issues which are important, but also controversial. So African states are sometimes not happy with our human rights demands in the LGBT rights, for instance, or the readmission agreements we are asking from them. So this creates some tensions. And when we look at Africa itself, as you said, we started seeing at one point, on one hand, we are seeing a duality because we have the African Caribbean Pacific group, and at the other hand, we have a growing African Union, which is more and more imposing itself with a free trade agreement on the continental level. And this is a great regional integration effort, and it is a flagship project of the African Union's Agenda 2063. what we saw so far that the EU has actually concluded 16 free trade agreements with sub-Saharan African countries, and it concluded 4 trade agreements with North African countries. But these agreements do not actually cover services, investment, competition, or intellectual property rights. Whereas when we see China, they just have 1 free trade agreement, and it's Mauritius, but they somehow exert more influence in trade relations with these non-traditional instruments, which are memorandums of understanding and these kind of more different instruments. So in response to these new actors in the region, such as Russia, China, Turkey, the EU actually has a strategy. It launched a strategy in 2020, its new EU strategy towards Africa, to maintain this priority partnership in the continent. Because there is a geopolitical rivalry, as can be seen. At the 6th summit between the EU and the African Union in February 2022, this year, the EU put emphasis of a new sort of partnership. So it is based on mutual interest and equal footing, because this is what the Africans are usually, as some of my colleagues said, they're accusing the EU for this asymmetric relationship, for the fears of neocolonialism, like EU being the lecture giver all the time, or EU imposing its own regulations. And so they call for equal partnership. And actually, the other actors are geopolitical rivals in the region, let's say. They promise African solutions to African problems. So they promise, solutions based on their interests, their norms, and their values, not our values. And this is actually a very important point. And this EU-African Union summit was preceded just before by Turkey-Africa summit and by China-Africa summit. So I think like there are a lot of things at stake. And so basically our African partners want to say, Turkey and China are offering us this, what are you offering us? So so they are actually understand the need to diversify their partners as well. So these geopolitical rivalries led the EU to develop the Global Gateway Initiative, as some of my colleagues mentioned. This will support, you were wondering what it would actually cover. It will support digital connectivity, transport links, and low carbon energy sources in Africa until 2027, and 150 billion euros were earmarked for the African region itself. But of course, there are problems with this initiative. So some wonder like how the EU will be able to get public and private investors together to be involved. Some, especially our African partners, are asking what are the conditions attached? So labor standards, environments, anti-corruption standards. So the EU is basically wants to see in these relations. And during the last summit, there were also other issues that were on the agenda, such as health issues, because many African nations were not happy with how we dealt with the coronavirus crisis, and they probably did not receive enough vaccine donations, and they wanted the EU actually to waive intellectual property rights so that they could produce their own vaccines, which didn't happen either. And some of African countries also were not happy with the economic partnership agreements that we had with most of the countries there. They prefer, again, trade partnerships which are based on more equal terms. By contrast, what does China do in the region? They say that their Chinese Belt and Road initiatives has no strings attached. So it could have some appeal for some of these countries, actually. And at the same time, China started to reduce its investments in China, and they started to reduce their loans in China after the pandemic. So maybe this is a good window of opportunity for the EU to be more active. But what we see in these promises as well, coming from China, there's always a debt trap. So some countries find themselves in debts that they cannot pay, and then they are giving their property rights to Chinese, and the Chinese have their own standards. I mean, they employ Chinese laborers and with their own labor standards, and it's a different scenario than the EU scenario, of course. But when you look at, for instance, Africa's biggest port, which is Tahrir, just 14 kilometers away from the EU, we see again Chinese investors. So one of the ports is operated by China. Also, their tech city is sponsored by China. So more than half of the 46 coastal port projects in Africa were financed by China, and 11 of them are operated by them. So we can see like how they're encircling, how Chinese are encircling the whole African continent with such infrastructure projects. So what can be done? I mean, of course, like the EU's policies are a bit criticized. So these partnership agreements we have basically don't allow some countries to have industrial capacity and industrial policy. Because when you see the trade relations as we have since many decades, we still could not go farther than primary goods and raw materials. That's the 2/3 of African exports to the EU. And we're still largely investing in the extractive sector. So I think this has to be changed. This has to change so that we can gain trust by African partners. Also, there is widespread perception that this trade relations for decades could not actually bring about any structural transformation and generate growth in the continent. For instance, Kenya exports raw coffee beans, which are roasted and packaged and sold by foreign actors, not by them, and of course at a hefty price. Nigeria has great oil reserves, and they're Africa's biggest oil producers, but they have no refinery capacity, and millions of Nigerians don't have even access to electricity. What is also important in this geopolitical battlefield is the digital, and I'll stop here afterwards. The EU is actually also fighting for influence in the digital sector in Africa, which is also very evident with recent visits by EU officials like Margaret Vestager, or Ursula von der Leyen's first visit was also to Africa. The recent visit of the Commissioner Vestager was focusing on EU-Nigeria digital economy package. This is an important development because it just follows some other countries. Maybe I'll give the floor to my other colleagues afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hadzhieva, Director of Dialogue for Europe, a Brussels-based NGO, for picturing this political and economic rivalry between EU countries and China ongoing. And thanks for reminding us that the EU has an agenda, digital connectivity, energy, and that the extractive sector is the weakest one in terms of trust between African states and the EU country. But we will go back to this with the questions. Now, last but not least, after our panelists, Kelly Falconer and Robert Tyler, announced it before our meet, they are not with us, we have Loredana Teodorescu. She's the head of EU International Affairs at Istituto Luigi Sturzo, a foundation based in Rome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I think that's very important to speak about Africa today, so to bring the attention back to what is happening in Africa, because EU is usually reacting to the different emergencies like we are doing now with Ukraine. But at the same time, what we need is really a long-term strategy, especially if we look at Africa, because all the challenges that we mentioned also in the previous interventions, all the challenges which are affecting Africa have a direct impact on us. So I have in mind instability, conflicts, these power and security vacuums, social upheaval, economic crisis, but also, for instance, the demographic challenge. So we have 22 million young people entering the African job market every year. And if we cannot provide opportunities for them, this can become a significant threat of instability. And then we have new security challenges such as the climate change. Already we have more than 14 million of people across Ethiopia, Kenya and Somalia facing severe hunger because of severe lack of rains. And then, of course, the consequences of Ukraine, which are affecting also Africa, especially in terms of food security. So I would say that Africa is already an essential partner, a natural one, and not only because of geographical proximity, but really because the prosperity and the security of Africa is in interest also for us. So let's start from there, from a mutual interest in building a cooperation and a partnership. All these challenges that we mentioned have an impact in the humanitarian sphere, but of course they have an impact also when it comes to migration. So they all could lead to what European politicians fear the most, which is a major flow of unmanaged migration from Africa to Europe. And I will say a few words on that as I'm dealing mainly with migration. I think that migration is a central part of the cooperation, but of course it should not be the only one. So we should have a broader perspective on that. In the last years, the European Union developed increasingly turned to third countries in order to manage migratory flows with a specific objective, the main one, which was reducing the number of irregular migrants to Europe. But of course, we have to bear in mind that we have different interests. So Europe's governments are mainly motivated to engage countries to fight against illegal migration. But this is not always a priority for the countries of origin. Moreover, they have few incentives to readmit irregular migrants. And on the contrary, immigration can also bring economic benefits, inflows of remittances, lower employment rates. So when it comes to migration, for third countries, it's really primarily about seeking opportunities for their citizens to reach Europe. And this puts Europe in a very delicate position because in order to cooperate with third countries, we need to provide some incentives, some concessions. We need to use a considerable leverage. And I have to say that in the last years, this was not so easy. First of all, because there is still a division among European Union member countries. And then because member states were very reluctant to use real incentives such as legal migration opportunities or circular migration. And all of this is undermining, in the end, the EU action with, as a consequence, slow progress and uncertain partnership. So it's really time to address these weaknesses and to make European Union, first of all, a reliable and coherent religion actor, which calls for a stronger foreign policy. We touched upon this yesterday in the working group dedicated to the foreign policy, but it requires also a deployment of a wide range of tools, not only related strictly to migration, and of course, a more commitment from the member states. But it also requires a different way. It also calls us to reshape really the relations with African partners in the sense of a win-win partnership, a genuine cooperation. First of all, this means having not only short-term priorities, such as migration per se or the reduction of irregular migratory
irregular migration. It requires a long-term strategy which is really focused on development. So to make migration, let's say, a choice, not only a necessity. It means not just formulating offers, but really come together to work on ideas and develop jointly ideas. It means working on common goals, starting from what are our common interests, and we have definitely common interests and shared goals. I think that it means also communicating differently the fact that we intend this as a partnership. There are already some good signals at European Union level, at least in the sense of the strategy, of the wording, of the EU-African Union Summit in February. But of course, then the war in Ukraine came and it's changed a little bit the perspective. The first consequence is the fact that we are very much focused on Ukraine, of course, but we should not forget about what happens in Africa. And then if we look at migration, the conflict in Africa generated a new wave of solidarity, and is generating also a sense of resentment or tension, new tensions with African countries, because they complain about the contrast among the warm welcome Ukrainian received so far and the treatment, how we treat the African fleeing from war. Of course, this is a unique situation. This is a war happening on the European continent. Migration is perceived as a temporary process in this case, because we all know that Ukrainian refugees want to go back home. But at the same time, I think that we can see it also as a positive step, because finally we reached an agreement among EU member states. We brought into migration system some kind of innovation, flexibility, a new narrative. And I think that we can start from there in order to build really this common migration policy and also a different way of cooperating with Africa when it comes to migration, bearing in mind that migration is here to stay and that we will need to face new urgent migration situations. So of course, this is something that we really need to work on, taking into consideration, again, the needs and the concerns of the African countries. And let me add just one last consideration, which is about the role of civil society. I'm chairing a network of women mediators in the Mediterranean region. This is an initiative launched by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2017. And it really proves the fact that for Italy, stability and the security of the Mediterranean region is a priority, but I think that it should be for European Union as well. But at the same time, it recognizes the role women are playing for the stability and the security of the region. So I think that when rethinking the cooperation with Africa, we should not have in mind only the governments, but also the vitality of the civil society, the human dimension, the connections among people, soft and cultural diplomacy. So I think that this is really important to bring into the picture of cooperation, women, younger generations, and the civil society. Thank you.
Thank you, Loredana Teodorescu, for bringing up here the issues of civil society, societies in countries. And sometimes the civil societies are really forgotten, neglected. Nobody knows who they are, except for people working in NGOs. And I can say that, if I may say so, that Ukraine crisis could be an opportunity, sorry for this word, to reshape this policy. It's not a way to renew and show again double standards regarding these policies, which is what exactly the African countries complain and citizens of Africa and Asia complain. We saw a lot of situations of Syrians or people from Africa living in Ukraine and stopped at the border with Poland, while Ukrainian by nationalities were flew to the borders. And this is disappointing from their points of view, of course. So let's say now we can open the floor to the questions. I think we have the time for 3-4 until 1:15. And so there's one there by Bill, I guess, another one there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. A quick comment, really, that then the panel might want to comment on in return about the vaccine experience during the pandemic. My question is, what did the vaccine behavior tell African countries by Europe? I mean, I think it told them two things. One, it told them that Europe, including the UK, are a technology superpower. BioNTech had the best vaccine, one of the best vaccines, AstraZeneca, developed in the UK. So we were the technology superpower, and Chinese vaccines and Russian vaccines were not an acceptable substitute. But we are also not a generosity superpower because we failed to put up resources to distribute vaccines, or indeed to break contracts of excessive purchases by European countries to enable Africa to buy those vaccines. Vital issue is manufacturing capacity in Africa. Clearly a basic expectation at one point was that Africa would be supplied by AstraZeneca vaccines made in India, but then India developed its own India first policy and it wasn't there. So manufacturing capacity is the key. How will that happen is my question.
We can pick the second one, so we answer to all.
Thanks a lot for excellent presentation, and I'd like to raise 3 points. The first one is about African development, which in my view rests a lot with the internal African trade. So we trade among countries that have a similar level of development. So how can we help strengthen the regional integration in Africa from the economic point of view? Juncker proposed that we should only have trade agreement with the African Union or with some of the regional integration that are present in Africa. But it seems to me that the Commission now is going in slightly another direction. What do you think about it? The second point is about the elephant in the room. One of the problems for African development is political instability, civil war, terrorism. And sometimes in Europe, there is this idea, this discussion about European Marshall Plan for Africa. But people always forget that the Marshall Plan had two legs. You only get the money if you accept the American military bases, because you cannot pour money in a country where you don't know what will be the political regime. And if you pour money today in Libya, for example, that money will end up in weapons, not in development. So this is a crucial issue that is linked also to the foreign security policy for the EU, but also about the possibility for the African countries to accept any form of military support by the EU, given our colonial past. So on the one hand, without that, it's difficult that we can really stabilize the area and ensure an endogenous growth. At the same time, I'm not really sure that we are in the best position to do it. And the third point is about the European Green Deal, and as the keynote speech mentioned, this is crucial. We won't get our goal unless we are able to invest massively in Africa, because this is pretty clear from all the studies about it. Thanks a lot.
Okay, there's a third one
Yes.
here, and then, yeah, and then I think there is already enough for all the speakers.
Hi, thanks. So I was going to ask about what can be done in order to increase the presence of the European private sector in Africa. It looks like, obviously, a lot of the Chinese investment are state-led. They're state firms, state-owned enterprises. As was said in the panel, a lot of them import Chinese laborers as well as the Chinese capital. The Turks have taken a completely different tack. Private sector construction firms from Turkey are actually outcompeting many Chinese firms in many countries, in part by employing Africans, relying less on Turkish labor, in part by striking clever deals with various countries. So what is stopping European firms from doing more business in Africa and contributing to development that way? Is it a fear that that it will require some dodgy dealing, which is obviously harder to do under European law? Is it a fear of security concerns? And what can be done in order to increase the private sector presence?
I have a very short question on the upcoming food crisis. This is because apparently in between Russia and Ukraine, the exports of wheat is about approximately 15 billion US dollar per year. The interesting thing is that 1/3 of the export go to one single country, which is called Egypt. And my question was, of course, the Russian wheat and the Ukrainian wheat is two completely different stories. But I was wondering whether there is a possibility there. Also considering that, strange enough, Europe does not have a shortage of wheat right now.
Thank you, Francesco. I think that there is enough for all speakers, so we can start with Leslie Mastop if he wants to answer.
Thank you very much. Those were excellent questions, and some of them were more really contributions rather than questions. The first one that I'd like to comment on, and I agree wholeheartedly with the speaker, when history is rewritten about COVID-19, I think our children and grandchildren will ask questions of our generation. Our response to COVID-19 was very problematic. When I say our response, I mean the global response, United States, European Union, the advanced developed world, because COVID-19 or global pandemic is a classic public good. In other words, it's a challenge that transcends borders. You can only solve it in one country or somewhere if you solve it everywhere. And yet the natural impulse was to look at this thing through a national lens. Let's produce for our country. Let's look at it through domestic lenses. Now, climate change is another global public good. There we have succeeded in building global partnerships that are deep-seated now. All of the various COPs that took place, COP26 took place in November last year, which captured the global consensus on how to move towards net zero. But in dealing with COVID-19, the response of especially the developed world was very, very problematic and short-sighted. As the person who asked the question correctly pointed out, we should have invested from day one into the capacity to produce vaccines at a local level within the African continent. In many countries, as you know, vaccines expired and were simply destroyed. It was only with the introduction of COVAX and the great work done by Gavi, the World Bank, and others that the support for vaccine rollout in developing countries was done. So that's just the first comment that I'd like to make. We need a new global deal, if you like, in responding to future pandemics that recognizes the transnational nature of a crisis of that nature, so that we do not repeat those mistakes. The second comment I'd like to make is on the question around the role of the private sector. The person who asked the question is spot on. The most important objective today should be to build private sector and industry and build the manufacturing and productive base of the African economies. As multilateral banks, ourselves, the New Development Bank, the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Africa Development Bank, all of us now have a new mission, which is to move away from lending mainly to governments and state-owned enterprises, to lend to the private sector, to put in place more green infrastructure, productive capacity for African companies to build and grow new firms and expand. What we now want to do in future is use our capital more in a catalytic way to provide the ability to reduce the sort of risky investment environments that exist in some countries, so that we can attract in more private sector capital. As you know, the legal regime, the investment codes, the ability to do business in many African countries is challenging for some European corporations. So if we come in and we are very highly rated, New Development Bank has a AA+ international rating from Fitch and Standard & Poor, all the the other institutions I've mentioned, the development banks, are all AAA. So we can use our high credit worthiness to create a more enabling investment environment, take the first loss provisions, or take a little bit more risk, and then allow in or catalyze more private sector investment. And then finally, as I mentioned, why I agree that we have to focus on the development of private industry. In that sense, we need to move away from an agenda driven by aid, development aid, and so on, towards more development of productive assets via investment in private companies. Thank you.
Sure. I'll just try to respond to maybe one or two questions. The European partnership agreements, there was a question about signing them with the region, with the African Union. Actually, it's very difficult to bring 50 or more African countries together and make them sign a deal, because the European Union already tried to sign a deal with part of Africa, which was the Southern African Development Community. But it's the deal, the European Partnership Agreements, only includes 6 out of 16 members. So that's going to be a challenge, I would say. And I would like to respond to the question about how can we have more business involvement in Africa. I was contacted by an American businessman who was on a private trip, for a professional trip in Congo. And all of a sudden he got detained, and he didn't have access to his lawyer for 2-3 days. And after that, I tried to help by contacting journalists, etc. And I don't think that this creates a very secure business environment. So maybe like security aspects are important for European business men to kind of invest more and be more present in Africa. But what is different with the Turkish business people, I would say, they're more used to working with these kind of challenging areas like Iraq or like Syria, or even other countries in Central Asia. So, and also they're a bit driven by the markets as they look for new opportunities, and there's a liberalization effort in Turkey since the 1990s. So they kind of focused on Africa. There's also a kind of neoliberal, kind of neo-colonial, let's say, project of the current government in Turkey, because they try to be an alternative to Europeans or Chinese by offering a mixed model. So it's based on this religious aspect as well as this aid aspect, but it combines military instruments as well. So it's not only trade and economy, it's not only big construction projects, it's only it's also training military and providing military equipment, having arms deals, etc. And this is on one hand, and on the other hand, they compete with the Chinese by having the same non-conditionality principle. And Turkish businessmen offer, they say that they have higher quality than the Chinese. So this is how they compete, and there's the soft power ingredient as well, like the soap operas of Turkey are very kind of famous right now there, or the restaurants with belly dancing, etc. But also the Turkish Airlines is a factor, because right now most of the African countries are connected by the Turkish Airlines. So there is this aspect that maybe favors some business people from other countries to invest more than the European businessmen, I would say.
Maybe, yeah, just a couple of remarks on political instability. Of course, Roberto, I agree with you. This is a big challenge, and I have in mind Libya, of course, but also many other countries. And that's why I think that we need really also to engage and to support the civil society. And I think that here conditionality, in the sense of putting some red lines, especially in terms, for instance, of human rights, can be helpful. And then on the upcoming food crisis, I think that is a very concrete risk, and it proves us, it reminds us once again that we need to be ready and to be equipped to face the consequences of these, also in terms of new migratory waves and flows. And it reminds us also that migration can really make us ourselves vulnerable. so it can be used as a way to destabilize European Union, which has already happened, for instance, on the Belarus border. But this is our fault, so we cannot let this happen. We should really act on this.
Allow me to make two cynical remarks on the vaccines. I mean, we didn't provide vaccines, so they got Sinovacs, most of them, and then Europe didn't allow them to travel to Europe because they didn't have a proper vaccine. Second cynical remark about Libya. Libya doesn't need money, you know, they have money. And let us not forget that one of the reasons, not the main reason, but one of the reasons the conflict was protracted was actually because Italy and France were both supporting the two different camps. So I mean, we do have sometimes a more constructive role to play in order to, I mean, instead of then saying like, what should we do? It's instability. Yeah, we sometimes provide, we sometimes help the instability by growing instead of by decreasing. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Koert and Leslie and Luca, Ellie and Loredana, everyone for your speeches, and thank you all for listening and for asking the questions. Thank you.